Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with David Hunt about the source-libertarian response to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge, according to which, although causal determinism would rule out moral responsibility, alternative possibilities are not required.
Thanks for listening. Well, I'm happy to introduce David Hunt, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Whittier College. David has been writing on the topic of free will and divine foreknowledge for many years, and some of his papers, including On Augustine's Way Out, published in 1999 by Faith and Philosophy, have been widely cited and anthologized. He's recently contributed to the updated Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on foreknowledge and free will, and he's currently working on a book on the problem of divine foreknowledge and free will. Well, welcome to the show, David. Can you start by telling us and our audience a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start with the last of those, and along the way, a little bit about me will, and my work will come out. I actually wrote my undergraduate thesis on free will. I think at the time it was the longest senior thesis that had ever been turned in to the philosophy department at Pomona College.
Okay.
And my sympathies were, I focused on the compatibilism versus incompatibilism debate, which was really at the center of things at in the mid 70s. Mm-hmm. And my sympathies were, squarely with the incompatibilist side, and they still were when I finished the thesis. But I obviously, as such things happen, developed a much stronger appreciation for what could be said on the other side, and really, it was much easier to develop critical arguments against compatibilism than it was to come up with an account of incompatibilism that was really satisfying. Yeah. Peter Van Inwagen's contribution to the Oxford Handbook on Free Will is, I think it's titled "Free Will Remains Mysterious."
Yeah,
that's exactly how I felt as I graduated from college. And I'd said what I thought I could say at the time about free will, and so in grad school, I moved on to in other directions. I should say a little bit about myself, is that my dad had in his study a set of the great books of the Western world.
Yeah.
And boy, as a teenager, I just look up at those on his shelf and think, I want to be part of that.
Nice.
And I read things I had no business reading as a 15 and 16-year-old. I read Descartes' Meditations and Pascal's Provincial Letters and Tacitus's Histories and Annals and so on. And I had a keen sense, of course, at the time that, I wasn't getting everything that was there to be got. But,
Sure.
Rather than discourage me, it just, got me, fired up to, become more competent in, following that conversation. And so that was one of the things that really, pushed me to being a philosophy major. And it also explains why in grad school I really had a heavy interest or emphasis on history.
Yeah.
And in fact, my first publication, this may be a first for guests on your show, was on Plotinus.
Yeah.
Maybe
coming out of a paper I'd written in medieval philosophy in grad school. And that interest in the history of philosophy is one I still have, and I've got a half dozen publications in ancient philosophy, and I thought at one time I would try to write a paper on each of Plato's late dialogues, and I got 3 of them published. And I'm proud of what I've done in that area. But the fact is, I had 2 years of Greek as an undergrad, no Latin, And so to really compete with, people as a specialist in that area just wasn't a good direction to go. And so I, trying to figure out just where, as we all do, where am I going to, really try to make a mark as um, uh, with a research program in philosophy. Where in that crossword puzzle of reality that we're all interested in, what part of it should I devote my attention to? And so I, when I got a job at a small liberal arts college, just a two-person department, philosophy department at the time, Whittier College. I was still trying to figure that out, and I just happened by accident, leafing through philosophy journals in the college library to come across a defense of middle knowledge in International Journal for Philosophy of Religion, and I had read Bob Adams' critique of middle knowledge in grad school, probably in connection with a Leibniz seminar I was taking, and I had become a Bob Adams critic of middle knowledge as a result of that. It just resonated. It seemed to me he was right, and so I read this article defending middle knowledge, and I thought I saw where it went wrong, and I thought it'd be pretty easy to write a response to it. So it was just the happenstance of coming across this article, leafing through philosophy journals, that led me to write a paper. And of course, it was a lot harder than I thought it would be. And I felt I really needed to get up on all the contemporary literature on middle knowledge in order to write something publishable. And so it came out in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion. And in the course of doing all that middle knowledge research, I also came across Bill Craig's Molinist defense of Christian exclusivism, and I thought he was wrong in his argument there. And so I wrote a second paper on middle knowledge. And then, getting into questions of divine omniscience just led me next to the big daddy of omniscience problems, foreknowledge versus human freedom. And lo and behold, this accident of, I'll write a response to this, article I come across in the college library, led me more or less to, well, here's the part of the crossword puzzle I'm going to devote a lot of attention to.
That's great.
And at the same time, my then wife started graduate school at UCLA in English literature, and we started going to a church near UCLA where I met a guy named Keith DeRose, who was a grad student at UCLA at the time, and he said, "Hey, Bob and Marilyn Adams," this is before they moved on to Yale and then to Oxford, they've got a Bible study every Sunday night. And I said, "Oh, you think I could come?" So I started attending that, and so here I was with Bob Adams, who'd written this middle knowledge, critique that it was my first encounter with middle knowledge. So he was reading the papers I was writing in middle knowledge, and then Marilyn, who introduced the alchemist approach to the foreknowledge problem. So I was at a little two-person apartment. This is before the internet. So how do you feel you're part of a broader community of folks who are interested in similar questions?
Yeah.
And Dirk Pereboom would sometimes drop by when he was in the Bible study. And then I found out through this group that Nelson Pike and John Fisher were going to be co-teaching a foreknowledge seminar, which was going to move back and forth between UC Irvine, where Pike taught, and UC Riverside, where Fisher's still a professor. And I was able to audit that class. Boy, that was just I can't tell you what a seminal event that was for me,
Yeah.
just as I was starting to think about, writing things on foreknowledge.
Yeah.
So that's maybe a little bit more about me and my background, but in sum, after thinking I was done with free will
Right.
when I graduated from college, I kind of came back in through the back door,
Yeah.
just through the accident or happy circumstance of, um, writing a paper on middle knowledge. And then, one thing led to another.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, we started off the season of the podcast by talking about an argument for the incompatibility of divine foreknowledge and human free will, where free will is understood as the freedom to do otherwise than what one does. And in the last several episodes, we've talked about various ways of critiquing the argument. For the rest of the season, we'll be talking about positions that are consistent with the argument's conclusion that foreknowledge rules out the freedom to do otherwise. On your view, which you've referred to as Augustine's way out, we can have the freedom required for moral responsibility, even if we lack the freedom to do otherwise. And so while divine foreknowledge threatens free will in one sense, it doesn't undermine the freedom that matters for moral responsibility. So is that right? And if so, why do you think the freedom to do otherwise, what we might call leeway freedom, is not required for moral responsibility?
Yeah, that's a fair presentation of what my view is, and the short answer to why I think leeway freedom isn't required for moral responsibility is Frankfurt counterexamples
Yeah.
to the principle of alternate possibilities.
Mhm.
And I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with what Frankfurt counterexamples are, but I'll describe them this way. The idea behind them is you start off with a case that's a paradigm instance of free agency of the sort required for moral responsibility. So it satisfies all your favorite criteria. You may come to the case with different views about what morally responsible agency involves, but it satisfies all your favorite criteria, right? And then one thing is added, or rather taken away. Alternatives are carefully and surgically stripped from that case that was so favorable to free agency, and then you're invited without affecting anything else that made it a paradigm case of free agency, and then you're invited to judge that this person's morally responsible, and so clearly it's moral responsibility is not in virtue of the presence of alternatives, but it's in virtue of the presence of all these other factors. And Frankfurt's way of surgically removing the alternatives was by introducing a counterfactual intervener who only does stuff in the alternative sequences. In the actual sequence, the person does what they do on their own. But this counterfactual intervener is ready to step in if the person were to have done something else, to step in to prevent them from doing it. So that's how the alternatives are stripped away. But because in the actual sequence, the agent does what they do on their own, you judge that the person is morally responsible for what they did. So usually alternatives are eliminated by alternative eliminators that mess around with with the actual sequence. You're chained to a chair,
Right.
or there's a chip implanted in your brain, and a Martian is controlling your neural firings with a joystick. But the counterfactual intervener is supposed to strip the alternatives away without doing anything like that, right?
Mhm.
So the whole debate over whether these Frankfurt type counterfactual interveners succeed in doing what they're advertised as doing is an ongoing controversy, and I've I've contributed a couple of tweaks or variations of my own blockage cases, which I'm not committed to, but I think are interesting
Yeah.
um, to think about. And what I've called buffer cases, Dirk Pereboom independently came up. We've independently proposed these buffer type cases, and this isn't the time to get into that whole debate. I think there's a couple of reasons though to think that you're within your rights in rejecting leeway freedom as a requirement for free agency, quite apart from how that debate goes. And one way is this: suppose you consider a Frankfurt counterexample, and you're deciding how to respond to it. Is the agent morally responsible or not? And you're supposing that Frankfurt has succeeded in stripping all alternatives. And you realize that, yeah, I still hold this person morally responsible because they did it on their own, right?
Yeah.
So I hold them morally responsible because what's sometimes called the source condition is satisfied. This person is sufficiently the source of their action for us to judge that they're morally responsible for what they did. The alternatives condition isn't satisfied, but the sourcehood condition is satisfied. And now you've undergone a gestalt shift. And I use that term because I think it's very much descriptive of what I underwent after I thought about, Frankfurt counterexamples for a while. I just underwent a gestalt shift. I started caring about sourcehood and not caring so much about alternatives. So now, suppose you're following this debate over whether Frankfurt counterexamples really do succeed in eliminating all flickers of freedom, as they're sometimes called, really eliminating all alternatives. And you conclude, oh, yeah, I thought in this case there weren't any alternatives, but I'm convinced by this article and debate that there are some residual alternatives, hanging around that, maybe are morally significant. If you've already undergone this gestalt shift, I don't know that would drive you back toward embracing the principle of alternate possibilities again, because what you've seen or think you've seen anyway is that the way I like to think about it is the relationship between measles and red spots. Red spots are a symptom of measles. Measles is the underlying condition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine cases. I don't know if this happens. I bet it does, but maybe it doesn't. That you could have measles without the red spots appearing. Something interferes with the appearance of the red spots. And I've come to think for the relationship between the sourcehood condition and the alternatives condition is like the relation between measles and red spots. What is the underlying condition constituting free agency of the sort required for moral responsibility? It's the right kind of sourcehood. That's the gestalt shift I've made. And whether or not the symptom of the availability of alternatives shows up or it's occluded by some bizarre, set of sci-fi scenario or theological scenario, I just don't care about that as much anymore. This is kind of a personal report. This is a good I underwent, but I guess I'm less invested for that reason in how the debate over Frankfurt counterexamples turns out. The second reason, though, is that Augustine, who's my hero on this issue, he didn't come to his solution to the problem by first coming up with a Frankfurt type counterexample with a counterfactual intervener. Right. He just thought about the divine foreknowledge scenario. And it seemed to him, as he thought about it, that this was a case in which the agent still did what the agent did on his own, didn't do it because God knew it or made him do it. The explanatory arrow ran from the agent back to God's foreknowledge. The explanatory arrow did not run from God's foreknowledge to the agent's action. And that's just what's going on in a Frankfurt counterexample. if it's successful.
Mm-hmm.
Frankfurt says the agent didn't do what he did because of the presence of the intervener, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm inclined to think actually that the foreknowledge scenario is a perfect Frankfurt counterexample on its own. It does not involve a counterfactual intervener. There's no debate over there being residual alternatives lingering around because God's foreknowledge is complete. Right. Yeah, I don't think it has to rely on aid and comfort coming from a Frankfurt counterexample.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, longtime listeners of the podcast will know we talked in season 1 with Carolina Sartorio about Frankfurt cases, and I would encourage listeners to go back and check that out. A lot of what she said kind of resonates or kind of overlaps with some of the things that you were just saying, David. But one thing that I take it you and she differ on is she takes the thinking about sourcehood to make it a lot easier to be a compatibilist about moral responsibility and determinism, whereas you are a sourcehood incompatibilist, right? A sourcehood libertarian who takes free will to require indeterminacy. So could you say a little bit about what you think the difference between determinism and foreknowledge is, right? Why is it that determinism rules out responsibility, but on your view, but that foreknowledge doesn't?
Yeah, and this is a place where I would differ. One of the few places where I would differ with John Martin Fisher as well. I would agree with her that it's easier for the compatibilist if you're not committed to defending the alternatives condition. I think as an incompatibilist, it's not easy enough. But I'll agree it's easier. The classic debate between compatibilists and incompatibilists was over whether causal determinism sufficiently undermined the alternatives requirement for free agency. So abandoning the alternatives condition means that the compatibilist is no longer obligated to defend what I think is the indefensible view of classical compatibilists, that you can still do otherwise in the freedom relevant sense. I completely buy Van Inwagen's consequence argument, for example. But then the debate is between compatibilists and incompatibilists, is going to shift to whether causal determinism sufficiently undermines the sourcehood condition on free agency, right? If you're a compatibilist, again, I think it does make your job easier, and you can point to features of sourcehood like reasons responsiveness, endowing the agent with guidance control, as Fisher's account. But I think you're in a better position there than you would be if you had to defend the alternatives condition as well. So I'll agree with that. But as an incompatibilist, I think foreknowledge enjoys a big advantage over causal determinism when it comes to the sourcehood condition. And it has to do, again, with the explanatory arrows. The explanatory arrows have become very important to me when it comes to the issue of free agency. We don't do what we do because God foreknows that we'll do it. God foreknows it because we're doing it. So divine foreknowledge doesn't threaten our sourcehood, right? But if causal determinism is true, we arguably, and this is where I would differ from Fisher and Sartorio, we arguably do what we do because of conditions in place before we were even born. And this arguably undermines the claim that we're the sufficiently robust sources of our action. I mean, that's an argument we could have, but that's where that's the difference it makes to me between foreknowledge and causal determinism.
Yeah. Well, you take this to be an Augustinian view, and as Augustine held, as Boethius and Aquinas did after him, God is timeless. So, do you think there's any connection between the Augustinian way out and the Boethian response to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I'm actually myself a Boethian. Whatever makes God more metaphysically interesting. I'm uh,
Like that.
I'm in fact, going back to my first publication, Big Apologize, I'm a Christian Neoplatonist at night. I'm an analytic philosopher during the daytime. I'm a Christian Neoplatonist at night. Um, Total mystic of the God. I love that stuff. But yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a puzzle here because Augustine did agree with Boethius that God was outside of time, and so it's a little. It may seem puzzling that he didn't invoke Boethian's solution. When Evodius raises the problem of divine foreknowledge in Book 3 of On Free Choice of the Will, it's explicitly in terms of God foreknowing what you're going to do, and Augustine doesn't correct Evodius's assumption there. Your one possibility, of course, is that Augustine just didn't figure out that you could make a Boethian move there. That was one response you could make.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be right. It could be he never thought of that response. But I think that he didn't need to. I think that their solutions support each other, and this is why putting God outside of time, like Boethius does, doesn't by itself solve the problem. If God is outside of time, but he's nevertheless making you do what you do as he knows you doing it, that's not going to help with free will. You still have to have the explanatory arrows running the right direction. Right?
Yeah.
The atemporalist move isn't going to do it by itself. And that's the move that Augustine stresses. Here's the direction of the explanatory arrows. And so I don't think he needs to correct Evodius's misapprehension about God's relation to time. It could be that, this will depend on people's conceptual capacities. Is it easier for you to imagine that God is outside of time, or to imagine that God is in time, but somehow something like reverse causation occurs so that he has foreknowledge, right? Maybe he has a time telescope. I actually like time telescopes. And actually fall into that way of understanding God's foreknowledge. But then you're going to run into all kinds of issues over, is retrocausation involved, and is that possible, and so on. So depending on your taste, you might be easier with timeless knowledge of what is to us future, or foreknowledge. And I think that's the difference between them. But they both have to have their explanatory arrows running the right direction to solve the problem.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, in some of your work, you've referred to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge as an aporetic problem. Could you say what you mean by that, and whether and how it relates to the Augustinian response to the problem?
Yeah. So arguments always present us with the problem of how to respond to them. And in the typical case, an argument is making a bid for our acceptance. And then our problem is to decide whether it deserves acceptance, right?
Yeah.
Does the argument provide good reasons for accepting its conclusion? So there we understand the point of the argument is to persuade us. But there's other cases in which the argument isn't trying to convince or persuade us. Rather, it's challenging us to figure out where it goes wrong. And that's an aporetic argument. And arguments don't come with labels attached to them. I guess in some cases they might. You might see an argument that's prefaced with something like, the following is clearly absurd. Your task is to figure out what's wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But they don't usually have labels like that. And it's up to the reader or the listener to decide how to take the argument. There isn't always a right or wrong answer as to how to take an argument. It may depend on the person. I mean, even I've in a couple places where I've referred to the argument for theological fatalism as an aphoretic argument. Bill Craig has also done this. Referred to Zeno's paradox, in particular the one involving Achilles and the tortoise, um, as an aphoretic. That's a classic aphoretic argument, but arguably it wasn't aphoretic for Zeno. He was a follower of Parmenides, who thought that motion was an illusion. So even in that case, you could take the argument, not aphoretically, and perhaps Zeno did. So I wouldn't want to say that the argument for theological fatalism has the label aphoretic attached to it. I just think that you're within your epistemic rights in treating it aphoretically. And the reason for doing so, if you are inclined that direction, is just thinking about okay, this is supposed to show that you've got an action that, in every other respect, is if there's any case of free agency in the history of the world, this is it. And now we're going to add one thing. Oh, by the way, God foreknew before this person was born that he's going to do that. I have a very strong, pull. Maybe not immediately when I first started considering the foreknowledge argument. As I thought about it more and more, it just became, more and more absurd to me that could make there had to be something wrong with this argument. That couldn't change a paradigmatically free action to one that wasn't free.
Yeah.
So I guess that's all I'd want to say. Yeah, that's what an aphoretic argument is, and why you could, plausibly treat this argument as one. Oh, just by the way, if it is an aphoretic argument, then it works just as well as a thought experiment. I mean, one puzzle about the literature in the foreknowledge argument is maybe no one's written about it more than John Martin Fisher, who is an agnostic. Why did he waste all this time on this? It's a thought experiment. You don't have to believe in demons to run with Descartes' demon hypothesis, setting up universal doubt at the beginning of the. It's a thought experiment, right? And so you can, and I think one significance of that is that you're not really taking the full measure of the argument if you just make some adjustments to your conception of God. That might remove God from complicity in this thought experiment, right? But it doesn't solve the problem any more than making adjustments to how we understand Achilles is going to get rid of Zeno's the paradox, the puzzle that Zeno's presenting to us. Achilles was not only very, very fast, the fleetest of the Achaeans, according to Homer, but he was so fast he could actually blink from one position to another without traversing any of the intervening. Okay, all right, so we've solved the problem. Well, then let's restate it in terms of David Hunt, who doesn't have, the property of hypercelerity. But just is ordinarily faster than a tortoise. And now we got an argument showing that can't pass the tortoise. So I think that's another feature of aphoretic arguments, that you have to be very careful that you've taken their full measure. You can't just adjust, add some information about one of the dramatis personae involved in it, including God.
Yeah. Right. Well, since your view is a sourcehood libertarian view, there's going to be objections from leeway libertarians who believe that alternative possibilities are necessary for moral responsibility. But we'd like to ask about a different kind of objection. On your view, divine foreknowledge precludes alternative possibilities without causally determining our behavior, and some, including Jonathan Edwards and more recently Patrick Todd, have objected to the possibility of such non-causal constraints. Could you say what you make of this objection and how you yourself think of divine foreknowledge constraining what's possible for us in a non-causal way?
Yeah. Patrick shared an earlier version of this paper with me a year or so ago, and I guess it's come out since then. When I consider his constraint on constraints, which is at the heart of his paper, in abstraction from divine foreknowledge, admittedly, it has a great deal of appeal. But I guess I'd like to say that the argument for theological fatalism, bringing in this kind of surprising argument, right, is going to challenge some of our intuitions, assumptions that we have, that it shows that non-causal constraints are possible. I mean, that's the upshot of the argument. Surprising, but there you have it. I think that if we're looking in the scenario where, okay, so now I don't have any alternatives because God knew before he was even born what he was going to do. If we look in the scenario for the usual suspects, there's no chains that are binding me. I can't find any cosmic policeman around to stop me from, performing alternative actions or detect any metaphysical force fields. I think those are some of the things he mentions in his paper. I think maybe we're looking for something that the argument doesn't give us any right to think are there. It's a more austere sort of absence of alternatives that comes out from the argument. There's Carl Genet's principle that our freedom is always the power to add to the given past, holding fixed the laws. And that's a sense in which if every other step in the argument works, I can't do otherwise. There's no other sense in which I can't do otherwise. I can do otherwise simply with respect to the physical laws. But given the actual past, I don't have an alternative to doing what God foreknew I'm going to do. And I think if we sort of focus on how austere this denial of alternatives is, then maybe that gives us a little defense against the otherwise intuitive plausibility of Patrick's constraint on constraints. His argument is really in defense of the idea that God can't foreknow future contingent truths, because the only way he could have what counts as knowledge is if these future facts are locked in by causally determining conditions. And there's two general grounds on which you could hold that position. One is to deny the availability of future contingent truths, and that's a big subject of its own.
Yeah,
and your listeners won't see this, but Patrick has written, I think, the best book I've seen defending the position that there aren't future contingent truths. I think he's particularly effective at defending that position from attacks on it. such as the prediction argument and other arguments like that, coming up with plausible defenses of the position that there's no future contingent truths from the standard objections. For me, the existence of future contingent truths is a datum.
Mm-hmm.
It's just luminously obvious to me. And this is one of the problems in philosophy. You've got people on opposite sides of big debates like this for whom it's luminously obvious
Right.
that they're right. And so this is a datum
Right.
for me. I just can't see how there couldn't be future contingent truth. And I think theories have to serve the data. So that's where I am on that one. But again, it's a big topic we don't want to enter into here. And the other reason for holding the position that God can't know future contingent truths is that though they're there, God can't know them. Maybe, but I haven't seen a good enough argument to convince me. And I wrote down something from Anselm. I want to get this right. God is not only that than which a greater cannot be conceived, but a being greater than can be conceived. And when I think about God that way, I think, I'm just not in a position to hold that God lacks the resources to know future contingent truths.
Yeah.
So, I think this is what I want to say, and a very good article that requires Patrick's article that requires careful response. He's very good as usual. But these are some general considerations for how I would respond to his argument.
Thanks. That's very interesting. And for listeners that are interested in thinking more about future contingents and whether the future is open, stay tuned for our next couple of episodes because that'll be our topic.
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us. This has been fantastic. Where can listeners go to follow your work or read more of what you've written?
I have papers on Phil Papers, and I did just last week pay some attention to my profile there. So I think my papers can be searched under my name now, and there's an awful lot on free will and foreknowledge and the combination of them. Also, the best paper any philosopher's written on the matrix.
I'm going to go look that one up.
A little plug for
Nice
for that little bold claim, but I'm going to make it here. Let's see what else. You mentioned the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on foreknowledge and free will. So that's I updated that very recently. So that's a good place to go to look for a survey from my point of view, but as neutral as possible is required by encyclopedia entry for that. Since I mentioned Plotinus earlier, I'll say that editions of Plotinus as Enneads typically include a little biography of Plotinus written by his disciple Porphyry, which begins with the surprising sentence, Plotinus, the philosopher of our times, was ashamed to be in a body. And some friends tried to get him to have his portrait painted. And he said, isn't it enough that I have to carry around with me this image, his body, of the transcendent? And now you want to produce an image of an image. Not having it. Anyway, if you hearing my disembodied voice, you want an image of David Hunt. There are some episodes that feature me on the program Closer to Truth.
Great.
Cool. Yeah,
We'll
that's a
link
good
those
trail.
too. Yeah, those are great.
Well, thanks again, David. In our next 2 episodes, we'll discuss open theism, as Taylor foreshadowed, and our first guest will be William Hasker, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Huntington College.